Preaching faces some significant challenges in today's society. We've moved from this kind of modernistic society to a postmodern society, and from what was largely a Christian-focused nation to a post-Christian kind of experience. The problem is that preaching has stayed pretty much the same through those transitions, and it's suffering in some ways because it hasn't adapted to what's happening in the culture. It's not the message of the gospel that needs to be changed, but the way in which we communicate it, well, that may need to take another look. And so one of the things that I teach here is I talk about the idea of narrative preaching. I think narrative preaching has a real opportunity to change the face of the way in which preaching is accepted, particularly in a postmodern, post-Christian age. And that's because it deals with the idea of story. It deals with narrative. And in a postmodern culture, narrative is a big word. It's a big idea. We're all talking about what is the great narrative, the meta-narrative as it's called. And so postmoderns are interested in what is the story. On top of that, postmoderns are heaped in story. They live on the internet. They live on television, movies, Netflix, those things that develop for them, that give to them, that communicate to them in story, in narrative. And so it seems to me that one of the things that we ought to be doing in the church is capitalizing on the fact that we live in this wonderfully narrative age, because we have, in my opinion, the greatest narrative textbook in the world to use, the Bible. The Bible is full of narrative. It is heaped in narrative. You can't go to the Old Testament or to the New without it having some kind of narrative base and experience. And so I want to talk for a few minutes about what narrative is, or how to develop a story, in the hopes that that can be helpful in whatever way you choose to preach. Narrative is the way in which we communicate. If you get a chance, take the opportunity to listen around the table to a normal conversation over lunch or dinner or just a gathering. And be quiet for a moment and just listen to what happens. You'll find that it goes from story to story to story. We talk in narrative. We're all natural storytellers. Somebody tells a story, and something in the story reminds us of another story that we experienced, and so we share that, and so on and so on and so on. So as storytellers, we all have an incredible ability. We're natural at it. It's how we communicate. But when we walk into a pulpit, we haven't analyzed what story is or how to go about it. And I think that there's a simple way of analyzing how to do narrative. And I think this will help in whatever kind of preaching you may do. And it's the difference between Joe Friday and break a leg. Now let me explain what that means. When we tell stories, when we tell biblical narratives, most often we tell that narrative as though we were 3,000 miles above it. It's kind of a flat story. If you remember the character from Dragnet, that iconic character, Joe Friday, it was played by Jack Webb. If you've ever seen the old TV show, Jack Webb was a Los Angeles police officer, and whenever he interviewed somebody, his great tagline was, "Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts." And that's kind of how we approach doing story, doing a narrative. We want to make sure we get all the facts in, all the facts together. Well, that's one way of telling a narrative. The problem is, it's not always an interesting way of telling the narrative. And in some ways, it doesn't allow us to be insightful in how we tell narrative. And so one of the things that we can do to change that around is move our concept of narrative from Joe Friday to break a leg. Now, I have a son that majored in theater, got his master's in theater, and one day we were having a conversation, and I said to him, "Joel, why do we say to actors when we want to wish them good luck before a performance, why do we ask them to break a leg? Seems like that's not very good luck." And he said, "Well, Dad," he said, "you know that the curtains in a theater all have names. You know what the front curtain is? That's called the main curtain. And when the main curtain opens, you know that there are curtains on the sides of the stage. Those curtains prevent you from seeing backstage. Well, he said in theater parlance, those curtains on the side are referred to as legs. And so when you say to an actor that's going onto the stage, when you say to them, break a leg, what you're doing is encouraging them to move the curtain, to part the curtain, to break the leg as it is, and actually enter into the scene. If you want to change the way in which you look at narratives, if you want to change the way you tell narratives, you have to move from Joe Friday to break a leg. You have to part the narrative and you have to enter into the story. When you enter into the story, you begin telling the story from the inside out. How people look, what it smells like, what it sounds like, how it feels, all become part of the great narrative that you're telling. No longer are you 3,000 feet above looking down as a kind of flatlander. Now you're inside the story, and inside the story you're telling it as it unfolds, as it happens. What happened here, what she felt, what they're doing, what he looks like. And suddenly the story takes on a greater dynamic. It seems fresh. It seems alive. It creates resonance, a feeling that the audience has that I'm part of the story. If you want to change the way in which you do your preaching, one of the ways of changing that is to move from Joe Friday to break a leg, to enter into the story, into the narrative of Scripture, and tell it from the inside out.